It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and Joe Dolan.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast. We are presented by DraftKings. Love those dudes. We've got some cool things brewing in terms of best ball contests for you, the awesome listeners, or people that watch youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. Make sure, whether you're playing best ball on DraftKings or you're over at DraftKings Sportsbook, always use the code Ross. But I got some good things cooking up behind the scenes for you to be able to go in a best ball tournament for free against me and Joe. Should be phenomenal. When I'm talking Joe, I'm talking the fantasy gangster. Some may say the fantasy goat, and he's got the social media handle to prove it, at FG_Dolan. Love me some Joe Dolan. The knowledge, the info, the delivery, the enthusiasm, the energy. Joe's my guy. FantasyPoints.com, by the way, it's the best website that's out there for getting information. It's not, I almost feel like the site, you guys branded it wrong, Joe, because it's so much more than fantasy at this point. It's not even funny. It's like draft evals. It's, betting stuff. Like, you guys are just like, it should be called footballsmorgasbord.com.
That's a little hard to spell, Ross. So we decided that we wanted to go with something that's nice and easy to remember and spell. So smorgasbord was the runner-up, though. I'll give you that point. Have you ever
been to a smorgasbord?
What's that?
Have you ever been to a smorgasbord?
Not a legitimate one, I don't think so.
Oh, dude, you got to go to a legitimate smorgasbord. Anyway, use the code 24FEAST. The time is now to start to make sure you're killing it in these best ball drafts. Nobody's as far along on the best ball stuff as fantasypoints.com. The code is 24FEAST. I'm Ross Tucker. I probably should have said that earlier. I think most of you know that, but hopefully we're getting new listeners or viewers or whatever every week. Former NFL offensive lineman, 5 teams, 7 years, bunch of different media gigs, bunch of different podcasts now. Tomorrow we got Tyrann Mathieu on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Really enjoyed today's conversation with Isaiah Adams, 3rd round pick for the Arizona Cardinals. That's well-timed because we're going to start today's show talking about the Arizona Cardinals. Follow me on social at Ross Tucker NFL. Follow us at Ross Tucker Pod. All right, last week, Joe, we're talking about fantasy football 2024 and the impact of the rookies. Last week we did quarterbacks. Today we are doing wide receivers. Before we get to the drafted receivers like Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals, I wanted to take your temperature on some recent veteran signings the last couple days, because it's the perfect day because we're talking about receivers. Tyler Boyd to the Titans. Odell Beckham Jr. to the Dolphins. DJ Chark. I feel like this is the 8th consecutive year DJ Chark has signed a 1-year deal with a team for like up to $5 million. Anyway, do any of those guys move the fantasy needle for you in any way, Joe?
The thing is, the thing that makes me is most interesting to me is Tyler Boyd, and it's most interesting to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, a signal that potentially the Titans are ready to move on from Treylon Burks, who really, I mean, if you'll remember, I think Treylon Burks in his first mini camp, like, he couldn't practice because of asthma or like there was worry about his conditioning, but it was confirmed he suffers from asthma, and it feels like he never got his feet under him after that. Multiple injuries, knee injuries that have been affecting him. So Treylon Burks, potentially a talented player who just never got his feet under him. At this point, the odds of him ever living up to his first round status are next to nothing. but you wonder if a team might be interested in trading for Treylon Burks. Now, the thing about the Titans, though, you look at the way they've built their team. And we mentioned this earlier this offseason when we were talking about the Calvin Ridley signing. They are really insulating around Will Levis. And I think the Titans are going to be able to come out here and say, hey, we're going to know really well if Will Levis is any good. Because they drafted J.C. Latham, Peter Skoronski they drafted in the first round last year. They go out. They signed Lloyd Cushenberry, so they completely rebuilt their offensive line. And now that you bring in Tyler Boyd to come in and earn targets alongside DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley, that's the optimist look. The pessimist look might be Calvin Ridley's the youngest of those three guys, and he's 29 years old. So if they move on from Treylon Burks, they don't have a ton of youth there at the wide receiver position, but that might not be their goal. Their goal might just to be, we want to see what we have in Will Levis, and having a bunch of veteran receivers is going to help us do that. But in terms of fantasy relevance, I don't see much for Tyler Boyd at this stage of his career.
OBJ or Chark in a best ball. Chark could be the guy getting a lot of targets with the Chargers, maybe?
Yeah, Chark down the field from Justin Herbert. Obviously, that is not... I think Ladd McConkey can do it, but I don't think that's going to be his game. Quentin Johnston is one of those big guys that people fall in love with because he can get stuff done after the catch, but you think DJ Chark can maybe back up Joshua Palmer on the perimeter and get some deep targets? I'd be more interested in DJ Chark in the last rounds of a best ball draft than I would Tyler Boyd at this stage of his career.
Interesting. All right. Let's move into some of these draft picks now.
One thing on Odell, Ross. Okay. He's just... There is no way I'm moving Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle down my board because of Odell Beckham Jr. He's probably better than Cedric Wilson and River Craycraft at this stage, but the bark is much louder than the bite when it comes to Odell Beckham at this stage.
No question. Let's get to these rookies. Very interesting, by the way. We're having this conversation after Treylon Burks has really flamed out, by the way. Let's start with the Arizona Cardinals and Marvin Harrison Jr. Sort of what you envision for him as a rookie and how it affects other guys that might still be there.
Well, the thing about Marvin Harrison Jr. is the opportunity is just going to be spectacular. Now, we see these kind of alpha wide receiver prospects come in and instantly produce. We've seen it with, Jamar Chase and Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle. The year all those guys went in the top 10, all three of them instantaneously produced. Justin Jefferson produced right away. CeeDee Lamb produced right away. That doesn't guarantee anything, but Marvin Harrison, you could argue, as a prospect, was better than all of them. And the thing about Marvin Harrison is the opportunity is incredible. The Cardinals were dead last in yards by receivers who lined up wide on the boundary last season. 68.5 for wide receivers who lined up out wide per game. That was dead last in the NFL. The league average for outside wide receivers in receiving yards per game is 108.2. So the Cardinals were basically 40 yards underneath that. They had nobody on the perimeter last year who could win. So Marvin Harrison's going to come in and immediately be their number one outside wide receiver. And also, there's very little target competition here. Greg Dortch is a decent slot receiver. Michael Wilson is a certain kind of receiver, contested catch guy, down the field guy, but he is obviously miscast as a number one outside receiver. Marvin Harrison's going to come in and immediately be their number one outside receiver, and his biggest target competition is tight end Trey McBride. So right away, you have a blue chip prospect in an absolute perfect spot to become a massive target hog. Since 2010, there have been 15 wideouts taken in the top 10 of the NFL draft. Out of the group, 11 of 15 went on to have at least 860 receiving yards in their first season in the NFL. It would be a massive disappointment if Marvin Harrison had just 860 receiving yards. If you want Marvin Harrison, you need to pay up. He's worth a second-round pick in redraft right now.
Wow. Love it. Awesome breakdown, Joe. What about Malik Nabers with the Giants? Fascinating situation. Supposedly they tried to trade up to get Drake May. There's been now multiple people I've seen suggesting that they think Drew Lock might be the starting quarterback there and not Daniel Jones. What does it all mean for Malik Nabers, Joe?
Yeah, so there's no question that Malik Nabers is an explosive receiver. Again, this is a team that has just Wan'Dale Robinson and Darius Slayton to compete for targets here. Darren Waller, I still think is going to retire, and even if he doesn't retire, I don't care about Darren Waller. He basically was a no-show for the Giants last year. Nabers obviously dominant in the SEC, and he's great after the catch. But again, as you mentioned, hard to get excited with Daniel Jones under center. Maybe Drew Lock gives us something. Maybe Drew Lock doesn't give us something. The Giants desperately need Nabers to stretch the field. Daniel Jones was a check down artist supreme last year. He threw deep over 20 yards in the air on just 6.9% of his attempts last season. That was lowest in the NFL. So Malik Nabers, even though he's great after the catch, he can also stretch the field. For Nabers to reach his fantasy ceiling, they need to throw the ball down the field a little bit more. And if Daniel Jones isn't doing it, then I think they're going to try to count on Drew Lock to do it. Malik Nabers, right now, wide receiver 19 in ADP. It's a little bit rich for me, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds rich, unless they think that the quarterback's going to be able to deliver the ball, and they got the O-line issues perpetually. It really is fascinating how long the Giants have had some of the same issues over and over again. The one that interests me too, Joe, is Rome Odunze, who went 9th overall to the Bears, the receiver out of Washington. And so now he's got to compete with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore. How are we divvying up that pie, Joe?
This is going to be really interesting. I think the most common comparison, and this is not a stylistic comparison, this is not comparing prospect profiles, but I think from a fantasy perspective, the most common comparison we're seeing for Rome Odunze is Jackson Smith and Jigba last year with Seattle. Come in with two established receivers in DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. Obviously, last year Seattle had DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, and turns out those two guys were the number 1 and 2 in Seattle. The difference here is Caleb Williams has never worked with any of these guys before. So while I'm sitting here and I would bet on Keenan Allen and DJ Moore being the two target leaders for the Chicago Bears, Caleb Williams is a clean slate. So if Caleb Williams really likes Rome Odunze, then maybe Rome Odunze produces more as a rookie than we think. Look, Odunze has all the makings of a receiver who earns 140 targets at some point in his career, but my opinion is I think we're going to have to wait a year, and I think Rome Odunze is a better dynasty option than a redraft option at this stage. Rome Odunze's ADP right now is basically at the end of round 5 for a guy who might be the number 3 receiver on a team with a rookie quarterback. That is significantly rich for me in redraft. But in Dynasty, it wouldn't be surprising if Rome Odunze becomes a top 10 wide receiver annually, which makes him more appealing as a Dynasty receiver than as a redraft or best ball receiver. Remember, DJ Moore's been a target hound for multiple quarterbacks on multiple teams. He's earned at least 24% of his team's targets in 3 straight seasons, and Keenan Allen's been above 20%. Keenan Allen was above 30% last year for the Chargers. So these are massive target earners. It's just a question of, does Caleb Williams come in here and really gravitate to Rome Odunze? And that's what I'm going to be paying attention to training camp reports for the Chicago Bears.
Speaking of paying attention, Labatt Blue Light always gets my attention when I'm thinking about what beer I want to drink. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. I should also mention Mother's Day, was it 5 days away now? MyFrontPageStory.com. I said this on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. I will personally sign and send you guys an autograph if you get your mom or your wife or your grandma or any of the moms in your life the best Mother's Day gift ever. Give them the cover story they deserve. MyFrontPageStory.com. All right, we're keeping it moving, Joe. And the fourth guy off the board, this was a little bit later. And, you had several other guys go before the next receiver went, and that was Brian Thomas to the Jags at 23. I actually have an interview coming up soon that I did with Sean King, the former NFL quarterback. He thinks Brian Thomas has the highest ceiling of these guys, has the chance to be the best player.
Wow.
What are you thinking, Joe?
I respect that opinion. I'm a little skeptical of that, but nonetheless, I mean, this guy was an elite producer last year. You probably profile him as your typical X. He's 6'3", over 200 pounds. And he was a late breakout or a later breakout because he played behind Kayshon Boutte and Malik Nabers. But then last year he went off for 1,200 receiving yards and 17 touchdowns. So this is a guy who produced in the SEC. Scott Barrett, though, looking at his analytical profile, 43% of his 1,177 receiving yards last year came on the go route. That scares me a little bit. Is he just a deep threat, or is there more that he can develop into? And by the way, he does turn 22 in October, so while he's not like super old, he's a little bit of an older prospect compared to somebody like Malik Nabers. That being said, I think the landing spot is a little better than I initially thought. The Jaguars failed to re-sign Calvin Ridley this offseason. Obviously, he went to the Titans for more money. We know what Gabe Davis is. The poster boy for better in best ball is Gabe Davis. Christian Kirk is best as an inside receiver. So Brian Thomas, really, his top target competition here are underneath guys in Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram. Brian Thomas has the ability to be the top outside receiver for the Jaguars as a rookie, and that's why I have him ranked higher than Rome Odunze, even though he went, and this is in redraft, not dynasty, but in redraft and best ball, I actually have Brian Thomas ranked higher than I do Rome Odunze because I like his spot a little bit better. I think he comes in right away, starts on the outside, and is the number one outside target earner for them.
Then we had three receivers that went towards the end of the first round. And it was interesting because then we had a couple like Keon Coleman, Ladd McConkey go at the top of round 2. So these guys were all sort of in the same mix in terms of how teams were looking at them. What about Xavier Worthy to the Chiefs? That feels like a best ball pick to me, Joe. A guy running a 4.21 for the Chiefs?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the picks that everybody's like, oh, here they go again. Give Patrick Mahomes the fastest receiver in the draft. And obviously, Ross, we have some news that affects Xavier Worthy's status. Rashee Rice is potentially in trouble with the law again after allegedly hitting a photographer at a nightclub. So the NFL is probably not going to be able to overlook Rashee Rice for much longer here. So Xavier Worthy, his ADP is going to take a huge jump. In my opinion. By the way, Xavier Worthy already is being drafted ahead of Rome Odunze. He is the third rookie wide receiver off the board in best ball drafts so people are viewing Xavier Worthy as, oh man, he's like a plug and play guy for the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, the thing about Xavier Worthy, if you'll remember, Brett Whitefield came on this podcast and was discussing it. He obviously at 4.21, he's a great deep threat. The problem is Brett thought Worthy really struggled to track the deep ball. And that, Ross, as you well know, just being fast alone doesn't make you a great deep threat. You know, the thing that made Deshaun Jackson maybe the best deep threat we've ever seen in the NFL was the guy played center field like Willie Mays. I mean, he could track the ball over his shoulder. He always seemed to be in the right spot to catch the ball. Xavier Worthy, Brett Whitefield said on tape, that was not the case. Now, according to PFF's college data charting, over 40% of Xavier Worthy's deep targets were off target last year from Quinn Ewers. Now, the question I have is, how much of that is on Ewers or how much of that is on the fact that Xavier Worthy tracked them poorly? So I have a couple of questions about Xavier Worthy, but there's no doubt that the Chiefs thought he's going to come in here and instantaneously be one of the best deep threats in the NFL. That's what the Chiefs thought. They wouldn't have drafted him or traded up for him in the first round in order to do that. So Xavier Worthy could have some opportunity here. Patrick Mahomes saw 10% of his 15-plus yard throws get dropped last year per fantasy points data. That was highest in the NFL. The Chiefs think Xavier Worthy is going to come in here and rectify that. But there are some issues with his prospect profile. Most notably, can he track the deep ball effectively? If he can do that, there is massive upside for Xavier Worthy with the Kansas City Chiefs. It goes without saying.
Right, especially with this Rice news, which will be very interesting to unfold over the coming. I mean, that is not good, man. That I don't even know if I got to that on today's Ross Tucker Football Podcast. I don't think so, because there was other stuff going on with Tyler Boyd and everything. So I'll dive into the Rashee Rice stuff on tomorrow's Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Let's get to these other two guys in the first round for sure, Joe. Ricky Pearsall for the Niners. This is an interesting situation because it felt like either Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk were going to get traded, but they didn't, and they say they're past that. I don't know if I necessarily believe them. They took Pearsall. What are we doing here, Joe?
If they trade one of those guys, then we have to completely reevaluate Ricky Pearsall's status. Outside of that, the question becomes, what number target is he in this offense? Because if they have Deebo and Ayuk, then obviously Deebo and Ayuk are ahead of him. George Kittle is probably ahead of him. Christian McCaffrey is ahead of him. Jawan Jennings, 49er fans call him third and Jawan. Jawan Jennings, obviously, who had a strong playoffs. He's probably ahead of him at this stage because of how reliable he is. So Ricky Pearsall, they took him in the first round, but I mean, this could end up being, in ways, a redshirt year for Ricky Pearsall. He's somebody Brett Whitefield loved him as a route runner, somebody who's great with the ball in his hands. He's probably, this isn't a player who, in my opinion, is like, oh, that's clearly Ayuk's replacement, or that's clearly Deebo's replacement. I actually think he's somebody who can do both things, or a little bit of what both players can do, and kind of an in-the-middle type of player for them. The problem is the target competition for Ricky Pearsall is so high right now that he's going in on average in the second round in dynasty rookie drafts, and he's getting close to being undrafted in best ball drafts. He is a very late round pick, and it's hard to argue that given how loaded the San Francisco offense for the time being is around Ricky Pearsall. That being said, we've seen Deebo Samuel deal with injuries, and if Deebo Samuel does deal with more injuries, Ricky Pearsall could be a very popular waiver pickup during the NFL season.
Yeah, it's a good point. We'll see if anything happens with the trade there, and also the injuries. Let's get to the last one in round one.
Yeah.
By the way, I've heard different pronunciations of his last name. I thought it was Xavier Legette. I was on in Carolina, and they said Legette or something like that. I was surprised. Anyway, Xavier Legette, Legette. Sorry, Xavier. I'll figure it out soon. The wide receiver from South Carolina stays in Carolina and going to the Panthers.
Yeah, so this guy broke analytical models in a negative way. He did basically nothing for 4 years in his college career, and then in his fifth year, he goes for 1,255 and 7 touchdowns after failing. Ross, he failed to have more than 200 yards in any of his first 4 seasons. He's the only wide receiver to be selected in the first round that has failed to produce at least 1.90 career yards per route run since at least 2017. He's at 1.75. So the Panthers are betting on an outlier here, and it's possible that these analytical models that store college production and project them to the NFL are going to have to adjust or are going to have to take into account the very strange COVID years. This is the last year of that, so it's something that maybe Xavier Legette is going to have to take into account. This is a big, athletic receiver, prototypical size. I still have him behind Deontay Johnson and Adam Thielen on the target chain right now. But Xavier Legette, I am just very, as opposed to drafting him in redraft, when I think he's a viable dart throw in the teen rounds, but I'm more interested to see if he can really overcome the analytical profile that suggests this is a prospect who does not have a profile that suggests he's going to play in the NFL and produce for a long time. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with Legette. The Panthers do need him, though.
You know what's wild? We had several receivers in the first round who might be wide receiver 3 for their team. And then I'm looking at round 2. We'll get into next week. Keon Coleman, Ladd McConkey, Jalen Polk. There's guys in round 2 that might be wide receiver 1s for their team. We'll do a second wide receiver rookie episode next week here. Other than that, I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.